All right, everyone. Welcome back to the 2025 Winter Learning Series. We are at our very last session of this series, 13th of 13, since January. I'm Dana Ripper, and here with me is Ethan Duke. We are with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Our mission is conservation via science, education, and advocacy. And as always, you can find out all about us on mrbo.org. This series would not have been possible without the Conservation Federation of Missouri's David Risberg Memorial Grant, and also, of course, our MRBO supporters, many of whom are on these webinars with us. So thank you all very much. We are at the end of the Winter Learning Series tonight, but I do have good news for folks that are enjoying our Monday webinars. We have Truman State University professor Vayu Gokali. Some of you may know him. He's a physics and astronomy professor there at Truman State. He will be presenting to us on a Zoom webinar on dark skies and wildlife on April 21st at 6:30. I am going to put the registration link in the chat right now. There you go. If you want to register for that. So we'll have a few weeks break, and then Vayu will be speaking to us. As far as this winter learning series has gone, we want to give lots of thanks to this audience. You have hung in with us through 13 sessions now, and lots of you have attended all of them, and I really appreciate that. I feel like we've all learned a lot. I know that I've learned a lot. Remember way back at the beginning in January with Zach Miller talking about a whole new philosophy of agriculture, and Sebastian showing us how we can make more welcoming and inclusive spaces in our conservation work. All the way to the middle with Jen from Kansas speaking with us about how we can be more welcoming and inclusive of predator species, for example, that are often maligned. And of course, we've also had several speakers on the topic of climate and the various issues that are destabilizing our climate and our environment in general, as well as having many detrimental effects on our fellow humans as well. So I hope overall that this series has done what we intended it to do, which, as I always said at the beginning of every session, is to make us all feel more inspired and informed, and willing to take action. So on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers for this evening. These are folks who are on the very front lines of the policy battles in DC, and we're really grateful that they've made the time to come and speak with us tonight about some of the things that are going on at the national level. And also, they've let us know that they're going to save quite a bit of time at the end for questions, so please have your most pressing questions in mind for a discussion at the end. So with us this evening, we have Sam Lockhart, Deputy National Director for Organizing and Campaigns, and Ross Griffin, Director of Government Affairs, both with the National Wildlife Federation. Thank you both for being here, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for having us. And I'm going to take 1 second and do the tech thing and share my screen. There we go. Hopefully folks can see that. Okay, great.
All good.
Well, thank you so much for welcoming us into this space and giving us a little bit of time. I'm going to kick us off by just providing a little bit of context on sort of the moment we're in. And then I'll hand it off to Ross, who's really going to get into a lot of the substance of what's been going on. So first off, there's a lot we kind of could anticipate about this administration as they came in and the new Congress because of the first Trump administration and the Project 2025 document. However, I think the fact that there was a Republican trifecta that's enabling this a lot of that agenda to move really quickly, rapid speed, that was somewhat unexpected. And so there's a little bit of a game of catch up that we're all playing to keep up with everything that's been going on federally and coming out of this administration. So we're going to do our best to cover as much of that as we can of like the high pressing issues that we're following most closely. We will not be able to cover everything, even in our space, just in the conservation space. And yes, and we have a whole team of amazing experts that we work with every day who are deeply knowledgeable about any one of these things. But we're going to do our best to cover a lot. So please forgive us if there are pieces that that we are not expert on every single aspect of this. So we'll do our best to cover a lot of ground. You're going to also hear a lot about attacks and rollbacks. But one message I just wanted to start off with is that this is not a fait accompli. This is not done. And a lot of what's happening is absolutely, there are opportunities for us to push back through members of Congress, using our voices. Like a lot of what is moving, a lot of times we're seeing executive orders or things get shared that then are not making it into implementation quite yet. There's a lot of, courts are getting involved. So there's a lot that's a noise. And then there's what's actually happening. So we're going to focus on the things that we're seeing move most quickly and where the impacts are really happening near term. And even in those cases, I think we're also going to highlight some things where there's real opportunity for us to, again, to push back, share our stories, and work through members of Congress, especially to lift up the voices of their constituents. So I'll stop there and really hand things to Ross to kick us off and dig in on what's been going on in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Sam, for saving me the easy job. Uh, as Dana said, I'm Ross Griffin. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the National Wildlife Federation here in DC. Before I worked at the National Wildlife Federation, I worked 7 years with a senator from Ohio, which is what I call my home state. And I did not tell Dana this, before I moved to Ohio, I lived the first 9 years of my life in Missouri. And shout out to our friend from Kirkwood, go Pioneers. My brother was actually a Kirkwood High School student for, I think, 1 year before we moved and wound up in Ohio. But yeah, I was born in University City and then moved to Des Peres for a few years of elementary school before we moved on. So still a Cardinals fan. Have not been back to St. Louis. Have not been to I still call it New Busch Stadium, but I remember the old one fondly. And I can actually trace, and I'm sorry to burn time on this. My dad got really into native plants and specifically prairies while we lived in St. Louis and started planting those in our garden. And so I can trace a pretty clear line from growing up in Missouri to becoming a conservation advocate today. So very happy to talk to you guys. Less happy about most of the things that we're going to talk about. So I'll try to get started here. We're going to start with kind of like administrative actions that President Trump has done through executive orders or agency actions, as opposed to congressional action or lawmaking. And I think the first thing that you've probably thought about or heard about in the news or that's occupying your mind is probably DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, which is the new, it's called an agency. I'm not sure it technically is one, but it's the new entity in the federal government that President Trump created, initially headed by my fellow Ohioan Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, and now just led by Elon Musk. And so the stated goal of the Department of Government Efficiency is to cut costs, reduce spending, and essentially make the government more efficient. It sounds really positive. In practice, they've followed the kind of Elon Musk Silicon Valley move fast and break things ethos. So far that has mostly caused damage. It has mostly been breaking things from our perspective and what we've seen. The two main actions, or the broad buckets of action that we've seen from DOGE, have been funding freezes and workforce reductions. These have grabbed a lot of headlines, so it will be no surprise to me if you guys have heard about a lot of this in the news. But I'll start with the funding freeze because I think I have more to say about workforce reductions. When the administration came in, on January 20th, they announced the pretty sweeping across the board freeze on any outgoing government payments. So that largely applied to grant payments through any programs. It was intended to focus on two pieces of legislation passed during the Biden administration called the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And it was intended to be kind of a review on what government spending was being spent, where money was going, what priorities were getting funded with federal dollars. And the intention there was to realign those with the Trump administration's goals. But what that ended up doing is just freezing spending across the board, confusing people, and holding up money that was already contractually obligated, where the federal government had signed a contract to pay X amount for services rendered. So this is something that we've seen, and I'll talk through some of the effects at different agencies, but this is something we've seen get reversed in some cases. Like certain pots of money have been quote unquote turned back on. And Sam's going to talk about, how some good advocacy from folks like you and from members of Congress, frankly, in states like yours, has broken through to the Trump administration, where a voice of organizations like ours, big environmental organizations based in DC, maybe haven't been able to break through. But some funding is still frozen. Frankly, it's really hard to track what's on and what's off. It has been a little bit easier to keep track of workforce reductions, and I think I'm going to talk more about that. But we can try to, I will touch on a couple of details about contracts and funding freezes, and we can try to answer questions later if you have specifics. Anyway, I said there are two big buckets of work for DOGE. The other one, like I said, is workforce reduction. And this began with what we in DC and maybe outside of DC called the quote fork in the road emails. Started with, these were essentially like a deferred resignation. I think the Trump administration called it voluntary buyouts, which isn't quite accurate, but basically every government employee, every federal employee got an email with the subject line was fork in the road. And that's what where the name comes from. And it offered them a buyout where they could choose to resign, but they would defer that resignation by going on administrative leave, I think through September 30th this year, where they'd receive a paycheck the whole time, but stop working, and then separate from federal service at the end of September. So that was the beginning. The next step was pretty widespread terminations of employment for any federal employees on probational status, which, the federal government, like many other employers, if you're hired, you go through a period where, your employment is probational, and, you get, I actually forget what the term is when you become a full-fledged employee, but it's essentially a trial period. And so the federal government keeps people on for a year or more under probationary status. And that means that those people can be fired essentially with no cause or with very little cause needed, or needed to be justified. So there have been widespread terminations of probationary employees. Others, in more targeted cases, have been placed on administrative leave. We'll talk a little bit about the EPA Office of Environmental Justice and others. Some agencies have been dissolved. The headline there being a little bit outside of the space of what we'll talk about here, but the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, was largely dissolved and absorbed into the State Department. And others have been, while they might still have employees, there's a financial agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that one has been essentially told to stop all meaningful work altogether. So all of that is kind of, I think, third or fourth way to eliminate federal employees, which is to, basically take away any meaning to their work. and make it unpleasant to come to work. So that has encouraged people, where their mission of their agency has been compromised or blocked. That's encouraged folks to take resignations or to look for new jobs and so on. So those are some of the tactics that have been used to reduce staff. And I'm going to talk through some of the rough numbers of staff that we've seen lost, and then some of the consequences that has led to. But just broadly across the government, we're losing. If you add up all the decades of experience of experts and experienced staffers working at these federal agencies, you're losing centuries of experience, and you don't necessarily get that back. People, federal agencies, they don't pay badly, but often if you are, say, a climate scientist or a financial expert, you could go make more money working in the private sector. And people choose to work for federal agencies because they care about their country, they want to serve, they're interested in public service, and because it's steady work with good benefits. When people stop perceiving this to be a rewarding career with rewarding benefits, I think people will stop applying for those jobs, or they'll certainly stop looking to come back after they dedicated years of their lives to service and were fired quickly without cause. So the damage here, just in terms of lost expertise, is widespread, and it will be lasting. It will be hard to rebuild the reputation of federal employment, and hard to attract that number of expert employees again. But let me pivot a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about the actual losses at agencies that work in conservation or are related to it. I think one of the most salient losses in the public is the firings of National Park Service employees and park rangers. And the National Park Service, while it's kind of the marquee public lands agency, isn't the only one. We at the National Wildlife Federation, because we have partners that are so vocal about the National Park Service, while we love it, we tend to also try to lift up other public lands agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, or because we're wildlife advocates, especially the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So to talk about some of these agencies, I think the most recent number I could find for the National Park Service is that well over 1,000 staff had been fired or had resigned. And I think you don't have to look far in the news to find, I think there's like a park rangers resistance movement, I forget what the name is, that hosted protests at national parks across the country. And that impact is going to be felt on the ground. I think, we in the conservation advocacy arena are already looking ahead to, spring break, which some people are already on. Many people, it's kind of an American tradition to take a road trip to your national parks. I've done it myself. It's had a big impact on me. But I think I think spring break will be a test case for how the Park Service can cope with heavy traffic and reduced staff. I think we will see, as we've seen during government shutdowns in years past, that it's going to stress out the facilities. There won't be toilet paper. The bathrooms might be closed. Roads will break. People will be taking pictures next to bison, and that's really dangerous and stupid. There won't be someone there to tell them not to. So I think we will start to see those stresses on these facilities and these services that people really appreciate from the federal government coming up over spring breaks. And then I think it will really hit home this summer, where the wear and tear on the facilities will get to the point where we are damaging federal property because there isn't enough maintenance staff, enough enforcement staff, law enforcement staff, and safety staff to take care of them and administer these properties. Another, I mentioned the Fish and Wildlife Service, and maybe you don't think of them as a land management agency, but they manage our national wildlife refuges, which are a great place. I know I'm talking to a lot of birders here, but it's a great place for birding, hunting, but also hiking, photography, whatever you like to do outside. Um, Before President Trump took office, uh, a major lane of our advocacy at the National Wildlife Federation, yes, someone in the chat already knows, was to make up the funding shortfall at the Fish and Wildlife Service and help improve staffing levels in the refuge system specifically. So before Doge even was a thing, a lot of refuges, more than half of refuges in the National Wildlife Refuge System had zero staff on hand. And that leads to all of the issues that I just discussed in terms of public safety, in terms of law enforcement, in terms of facilities maintenance, and so on. So that leads to the degradation of these federal resources and these public lands. Now, just what, 3 months or less into the Trump administration, there are over 400 staff that have been lost from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's coming to an already cash-strapped and understaffed agency. That will have consequences beyond just our vacations. The staff that don't just administer wildlife refuges are doing important research, helping to bring endangered species back from the brink of extinction and so on. So there are studies interrupted. There are you know like population rehabilitation efforts that are pretty much on life support, as facilities where they're breeding captive animals are left to just feeding the animals and really doing more. So when I talk about long lasting impacts from these staff losses, these are some of the things we're talking about. I'll try to move quickly on. I'm not really watching the clock, Sam, but I wanted to talk about, I'm from Ohio. I was born in St. Louis. I live here on the East Coast now. People always remind me that I come from states with lots of corn. So I'm not going to ignore the Department of Agriculture. Over 3,000 employees have been fired or have resigned from the Department of Agriculture. And that is not just in DC. And really, none of these cuts are just in DC, but I think that was implicit talking about our parks. This includes outreach staff at USDA, includes staff from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, staff that are on the ground in communities across the country, in farm country, doing outreach to individual farmers, getting to know their land, helping them with their crops, helping them implement conservation practices on their land. Those staff will now be gone. They'll be consolidated. It will take people will have to drive hours to get to their nearest conservation officer. And I think probably more impactful in the short term is that I talked about funding freezes. Some of the funding that has been frozen affected contracts that were signed with farmers by Natural Resources Conservation Service offices to implement conservation practices on their farmland. That means that through programs like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, farmers signed a contract with USDA, agreed to, say, plant buffer strips around the edge of their field to protect water quality, and went ahead and did that with their own money, expecting to be reimbursed via this contract with USDA. Those have been frozen, and farmers are not getting paid back for practices that they had not budgeted to pay out of their own pocket. And so that's impacting people's bottom lines on farms across the country, in Trump states and blue states, really from coast to coast. So that is there has been a legislative response to that. It was just introduced this week. It's called the Honor Farmer Contracts Act, but it's unclear whether those will all get unfrozen or whether that will be done in an orderly manner or targeted in certain areas or practices or what have you. I also want to talk about kind of human health and public safety. we're talking about visiting parks and vacations. We're talking about kind of the business and economic impacts for at least rural areas and the agricultural economy. Um, the staff firings have been largely indiscriminate because they've used kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities like firing probationary staff. That has impacted staff who have a direct effect on whether or not wildfires reach human inhabited areas, for instance. So the Forest Service, a part of USDA, I don't actually have I don't have the number of how many staff have been lost at the Forest Service, but when staff reductions began, the Trump administration had said that wildfire firefighters would be exempt from any terminations. Those staffing levels would not be reduced. We have seen that has not been the case. It's possible that frontline firefighters have been exempted, but there are reports coming in from all over the country that staff at the United States Forest Service who hold what's called a red card, which is a wildfire firefighting certification, have been let go. Many of them very experienced, because something I didn't know. If you are an experienced staffer, but you transition to a new role, you get placed back on probationary service. And so people with sometimes decades of experience have been let go under the probationary reductions. So what this means, if we're losing capacity to fight wildfires, is that there will be more wildfires. They will go unchecked. They will threaten people's homes. Beyond just the staffing at the Forest Service, I talked about contracts with USDA and how that impacts farmers. There have also been reports where contracts with firms that contract with the government to carry out fuels reduction services in forests and reduce the risk of wildfires. Those contracts have also been canceled. And so some companies that send people out to cut underbrush and remove it from the forest and reduce risk, they've had to stop work on that. And so those fuels will build up. And if it's a dry summer, wildfires will be a bigger risk. Lastly, talking a bit more about human health, the EPA has an Office of Environmental Justice, which is focused on reducing the additional burden of pollution that frontline and fence line communities have tended to face. These are communities that are often disenfranchised for one reason or another. Lower income, tend to either be located near polluters or have polluters located near them because they don't have the voice to speak or the resources to speak up for their rights and to protect their own health. So since the George H.W. Bush administration, there's been an Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA. And one of the first moves of Administrator Zeldin, who leads the EPA, was to furlough all that staff. They were reinstated, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the office has now been closed. And so that just shows that the priority here is not on protecting human health. And we're going to talk a little bit about some other EPA rollbacks that reflect those priorities in a bit after I have a drink of water and take a brief break. Which I'll do now because I've lost my train of thought. Sam, help me out.
Yeah, that was a lot of information. So it's probably good for everyone's brain to take a pause now anyway, as we get through all of this funding freeze. And I'm seeing some questions already come through. So looking forward to getting to those at the end. Yeah. Anything else you want to say about the EPA office, or you want to move on to regulatory?
Yeah, I'll finish the thought I started, and then we'll pivot a little bit to I'll do regulatory rollbacks quickly, and I'll talk a little bit about Congress and what we can expect in the weeks and months to come. But I said that EPA staff were reinstated. Staff have been reinstated in some cases due to court orders. That sounds good, and in some cases it has been good. In other cases, the administration has reinstated staff, because they realized they were essential. Like there have been some kind of viral stories about nuclear weapons staff being reinstated because they were kind of accidentally fired, and they realized that's pretty vital to have those experienced staff in place. Others have been reinstated via court order. If there's one thing we all know about Donald Trump is that he is litigious, and a court order is going to be fought against. So I wouldn't, when you hear that staff have been reinstated, I wouldn't necessarily assume that that means they're back on the job that they were hired to do. In some cases they might be, but in others they might be put on administrative leave as soon as they're reinstated, or transferred to another position, or told basically to put their feet up and not do any of the work. A point I just have to make, because I can't resist it, is that none of this is very efficient. It doesn't save a lot of money or time to fire experienced staff and then rehire them to do the same job, and then get rid of them again. But I digress. So on to regulatory rollbacks. So as at the beginning of every administration, most high-level leaders in a presidential administration need to be confirmed by the Senate. So it takes a little bit of time before the agencies really get up and running. The Senate has worked really hard, and typically does in the first year of an administration, to get the cabinet secretaries confirmed, folks that lead agencies like the EPA and so on. So we're beginning to see the direction that these agencies are going to head in, now that they have most of their leaders in place, and as they're kind of filling in underneath that. And one thing I wanted to share is a signal of direction from the EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin. Is he announced and publicized this as he announced the reconsideration of 31 regulations that the EPA had put out, protecting clean air, clean water, fighting climate change, and so on. And I promise I won't read the whole list of 31, but I will rattle off a few of the things. He announced that the administration was going to reconsider wetlands protections, which we often refer to under a terrible DC acronym of WOTUS, or Waters in the United States. He announced that they would reconsider regulations protecting communities from coal ash ponds, which collect pollution from or waste material from coal power plants, and collect them in retaining ponds that can leak and pollute waterways. He announced the reconsideration of clean air standards for pollutants like mercury and soot. He announced the reconsideration of regulations of CO2 emissions from both coal plants, but also the fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks that have gotten ramped up, save us money at the gas pump and protect clean air, that have been in place for decades. And then one thing I'll pay some special attention to, because it's confusing, is they've announced the reconsideration of the endangerment finding. What is the endangerment finding? The endangerment finding was like a declaration by the EPA in 2009 that because greenhouse gases cause human harm, because they help warm the climate, that greenhouse gases, the EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And so that kind of underpins the EPA's authority to set limits for CO2 emissions from coal plants, or to take climate action more broadly. And so rather than rolling back individual protections in every case, the endangerment finding rollback kind of rolls back the foundation for a lot of regulations that have been built on top of that since 2009. So it's kind of like pulling out the Jenga piece at the bottom of the tower, or it could be. So those are 31 policies. I think this was called the biggest deregulatory day in history, something maybe pithier than that. These are just beginning. There is a whole regulatory process that the agency needs to go through, so these weren't all undone in a day. But it is an announcement of the intention to come. we see it as, a target list of advocacy actions. Each one of these rulemakings to undo these rules should require by law a comment period, and that leaves an opportunity for people or for organizations like ours to mobilize our members to leave comments to talk about why each of these rules is important. So it shows we've got our work cut out for us, and it provides a lot of opportunities to get a touch point in, but it also shows what's at stake here. It's quite a lot. I think I'll skip over NEPA. No, I'll cover NEPA briefly. I'll try. So one more rollback that has been announced is affects the National Environmental Policy Act. National Environmental Policy Act was passed in 1977. It created the Council for Environmental Quality at the White House. And you may be familiar with it in that it requires, or you may be familiar with it in general, but if you're not, you may have heard of environmental impact assessments. And these are evaluations of the environmental impacts that are required whenever the federal government is carrying out a major federal action. Usually, like a really easy way to think about this is if the Federal Highway Administration is planning an interstate highway, they need to plan a route. You might choose the ideal route to get from point A to point B. And then in doing the environmental impact assessment, you find that, there's a vital wetland with 8 endangered species along that route. And if you build a highway over it, you'll cause 8 extinctions. The runoff into the waterway will poison drinking water for 25,000 people downstream. That will be a clear indication that you should build it on a different route. In the process of federal permitting for major projects like that, I largely think about it in terms of infrastructure, but it's broader than that. NEPA is the law that requires that the federal government consider environmental impacts. And the rollback that has been announced is that I mentioned that entity, the Council for Environmental Quality, they issue regulations that tell agencies how to implement NEPA, and they've done so since 1977. What the White House announced is basically that the Council for Environmental Quality, I'm going to lean on my acronym now, CEQ, does not have rulemaking authority and cannot implement regulations. And so they will look to rescind every regulation that CEQ has put in place since 1977. And basically strip any rulemaking authority from behind NEPA. So that will not eliminate NEPA, but it will make it way more confusing for agencies to follow and for projects to follow because it will just rely on court rulings instead of the clarity of the rulemakings that have come out of CEQ over the last 50 plus years. So I'll stop there on regulatory action and look ahead a little bit more as we talk about legislation, but I'll take a drink of water. Okay. Legislation. So Congress right now, if you're not aware, is controlled, both chambers of Congress are controlled by Republicans who are largely, at least so far in this, so far this year, have largely been working alongside and deferential to the Trump White House. And they're doing that because they have kind of a rare opportunity to use a process called budget reconciliation to pass a bill without any Democratic support whatsoever. This is not purely a Republican phenomenon. It's something that has been used. It was used by Democrats to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the most consequential climate action by the federal government ever. It was used to pass the Affordable Care Act back in, was it 2010? And more recently, it was used again by Republicans to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act during the first Trump administration in 2017. Really what this process is, I could get really in the weeds about it. I'm going to try not to. Sam's going to stop me from doing it. But basically, this is a process that, um, let me back up. So typically, the Senate is designed to be the slower of the two congressional chambers. And I apologize if this is an elementary civics lesson. The Senate is supposed to be where, uh, you know, high-minded senators who each serve for 6 years, get together and hammer out bipartisan compromise and kind of temper the heated passions of the House, known as the lower chamber. And one way that the Senate kind of forces that to happen is that in order to end debate on a bill and proceed to a vote and pass it, they usually require 60 votes from senators, so 2/3 of the senators to vote yes, simply on just agreeing to stop talking about the bill and vote on it. And then the bill, when it actually passes, only requires a simple majority of half the 100 senators, or 51 of the senators. So that typically, because the way the Senate has been composed, at least in my lifetime, it's been a pretty narrow majority. Um, I think in the last two Congresses, it's just been like one or two votes uh, for the majority, and that means that in order to get to 60 votes to proceed to a vote on any legislation, that means you need some of your opposition party um, to support that as well. So that's what I'm. A long story short, the Senate is supposed to require 60 votes to pass legislation. That requires bipartisan cooperation, and usually that means that it's difficult, or it's more difficult to pass the president's agenda, even when they control both chambers of Congress. However, there is this process called budget reconciliation, which allows a simple majority vote to pass pretty consequential legislation through the Senate. And that is why it has become an ever more popular process. And that's why some of these landmark bills that you've heard of, and usually the president's biggest accomplishment of their first term, is achieved through budget reconciliation. Others that I left out actually are, I think the COVID relief bills were done through budget reconciliation. So a lot of federal money, because this is a budget process, it typically deals with spending. So a lot of federal money, a lot of grant programs um, uh, have come through budget reconciliation. But so that is a process that congressional Republicans are working on right now. We're expecting news on them moving forward this week, actually. But I won't talk about the process as much because it is confusing. I will just talk about like the objectives. The main objective that Republicans have stated in using the budget reconciliation process, and it's set up particularly well to do this, is to pass tax cuts. Specifically, they want to extend the 2017 tax cuts that were passed under Trump's first term. They can extend it for 10 years. The Senate is actually pushing to make them permanent. However, because the current Republican Party is one characterized by fiscal conservatism, they are concerned about the deficit and the impact that tax cuts, which mean lost revenue, could have on the deficit. They also want to pay for those tax cuts by, cutting spending or securing more revenue from other places. And that's where conservation policy comes in, because they're looking at the whole of government as to where they could either stop spending money and save it, or use federal resources to draw in more revenue. So I do not have, I think I'm remembering off the top of my head, the tax cuts I think would cost something, the tax cuts that the House has proposed would cost something like $4.5 trillion over 10 years. And I don't have the math for how all the proposed pay-fors would add up, because we don't know we don't know what that number is, and we don't know where all the money, where the 4.5 trillion would come from. But some of the things that have been proposed, or that we expect we'll see, um, uh, are number one, I've mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which had billions of dollars that went toward reducing carbon emissions. They went towards climate resilience. They went towards environmental justice and reducing air pollution and overburdened communities. A lot of that money has been spent, but not all of it. I can say specifically under USDA, there was $20 billion for farm conservation practices to pump money into those really popular programs like EQIP that I mentioned earlier, and others that help farmers put conservation practices into effect on their farms. That $20 billion had not been spent. And anything that hadn't been spent from that bill is vulnerable for getting rescinded and counted as savings that can help go towards that $4.5 trillion of tax cuts. So we have been working hard, for instance, to protect that USDA conservation funding. I think we actually have a great chance of doing that, but I will talk about that in a minute if we have time. There are other things like there's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is one you may have heard about in the news that certainly has a target for recouping a few $billion and others. But basically, the Inflation Reduction Act is a big target of how to pay for those tax cuts. Sam, are you off mute for?
Yeah, I'm just doing a quick time check that I want to make sure there's some time for questions. So I know there's, we overestimated, I think underestimated how much content there was to get through here, but.
Yes, and how long-winded I am. Okay, I will, I'll move quickly. So other things that we've seen before, obviously when oil is leased on federal lands, the government gets receipts. So if an oil company, basically an oil company has to pay the federal government to extract oil from public lands. That leads to revenue. And so required lease sales have raised revenue in the past. That was in the 2017 tax law where they required lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That we can certainly expect. How much of it, we're not sure. We will see soon. One thing we're actually really concerned about that has been kind of floated around in rumors is the sale of public lands. There's an ongoing court case that I won't talk too much about in Utah, where Utah sued basically for the right to sell off federal lands within the state of Utah. So while we've been watching and opposing that lawsuit as much as we're able to, we're also concerned that the federal government through legislation could sell off public lands. And, we don't know what that could look like. It could be the worst case scenario is like selling off Yellowstone. That's pretty dramatic and probably not going to happen. But, there are less beloved or lesser known public lands all across the country that could be sold for quick hits of revenue to pay for those tax cuts. So that is something we'll be looking out for. Again, not promised, but a risk. And all of these things you may see in the budget reconciliation process that I expect, if you haven't heard of yet, you'll start to hear about soon as Congress really gets to work on it in the next couple of weeks. If I have a little, Sam, should I stop here or should I touch briefly on CRAs and appropriations? Really briefly. Okay. So the Congressional Review Act, that is a bill that was, I think, put in place in the early 90s by Newt Gingrich and company to allow Congress to legislatively rescind a regulation from the administration. And I won't get through all the rules and parameters that have to do with that, but basically it's gotten very popular at the beginning of a new presidential administration to use the Congressional Review Act to undo regulations from the previous president. And so we've seen a few of those, and that's something that you will see for the next few weeks at least, where Congress this year has been able to undo regulations from last year. The one in the environmental space they've already undone is a rule called the methane fee, where natural gas companies have to pay a fee for leaks in their gas systems that leak methane, a greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. There is one that has not been voted on yet. I know I'm talking to bird people here, but I have a fish for you. Um, and this is just indicative of how these rules have been used to undo Endangered Species Act protections. They have been targeted at birds before, but the long-fin smelt, which is a fish in the San Francisco Bay, has been targeted. There's a bill introduced that would remove Endangered Species Act protections for that fish. And so that's obviously something that we would oppose, and it can have long-lasting impacts on the ability to look after species like that. That's another thing we're going to be seeing a lot of in the next few weeks in Congress. And then lastly, after they get through budget reconciliation, if they're able to pass their tax cuts, in September, there will be another government shutdown deadline. Currently, the government is funded through September 30th. And that will be time for appropriations. I just that's really far away. Like work hasn't really started on what bill they'll write to fund the government for fiscal year 2026. But one thing we can expect, just because it's been part of the conversation, for months and really for the last like 2.5 years, is that Congress, as currently constituted, is going to want to cut spending a lot. And they're going to have trouble passing a bill to keep the government open if they can't do that, because their rank and file members will refuse to vote for a bill that doesn't cut as much as they'd like to see. So when we get to that point where they are looking at funding the government for beyond September 30th, you can expect to see a lot of fights over slashing agency budgets. All these cuts and freezes and staff cuts that we've seen done through administrative action, I think that's where we'll start to see attempts to codify them in law, where, okay, you fired 3,000 staffers at USDA. That means we can slash the equivalent of 3,000 people's salaries from the budget, and take away the resources that were there to serve that staff. So it's hard. It would be mostly conjecture if I really got talking in more detail about that at this point. But just preparing you guys for what we know is going to be a big fight in September. I'll just stop there. Sam, if there's anything else I should cover, let me know. I also know you have things to say, so I'm going to mute.
I should give you a round of applause or something. And I'm so glad this is recorded because I learned a lot listening. And I'm so grateful for everything you're covering. I just wanted to end on a slight note about what we can do from here. That was a ton of information that Ross just downloaded into all of our brains. So a lot to process. But I want to just talk about, where to go from here. Right now, obviously there's this sense of like what's breaking through, how can we have an impact, and I think particularly if you have any members of Congress, but particularly Republican members of Congress right now, it is actually penetrating the message about particularly workforce reductions, funding freezes, the stories of impacts on the ground and how it's hitting communities, how it's hitting constituents. That is starting to get reported on. A lot of behind the scenes rumblings and deal makings that are helping to restore that funding, restore some of the workforce, or stop further cuts from happening in those spaces. It's not necessarily going to be, a member jumping up and down and advertising that they're doing something that opposes the administration action, or that they're going to vote, against a big piece of legislation or anything like that. But there are those opportunities to push on these members and make sure they are hearing the real stories. And we're seeing that happen. We're hearing, up on the Hill from members of Congress saying how many calls they're getting, town halls that are getting shut down, that they are really feeling the heat from this. And there is some reporting about some of the members that are starting to really push back on that. So point being, we do still have a lot of power here to push back, to stop these attacks from hitting as hard as they can. And I just encourage you all to do everything you can. If you don't have the Capitol switchboard phone number like saved in your phone, save this number. You don't have to know every member of Congress number. You can go on the Capitol switchboard and they'll get you to the right place. And call all the time, email and ask for a response, write letters, attend meetings if you have access to be able to reach out and have a meeting at a district office with staff of a member of Congress. You're a constituent, you're allowed to do that. They work for us. So definitely encourage you to do that. If there are town halls that are still happening, look out for those and attend, ask questions. And I think the key here is that was a lot of information. We're not all gonna be at Ross level knowledge every day. I'm not, certainly. But you don't have to be an expert. You just have to be able to tell your story. And the more personal and specific the stories can be, if you know of impacts that you're seeing in your communities, to your neighbors, to the wildlife, to the habitat that you, the refuge system that you take advantage of and look forward to be able to go and bird and see things, and there's no staffing and there's no funding to support the maintenance, and those are the stories that I think are most impactful. So I think everyone is going to have those stories. If you don't have them yet, unfortunately, after everything we just heard, you might have them in the next few months. And really think about what's the story that you want to tell, and focus on that rather than focusing on being a policy expert, because that's going to be more powerful than anything we can say, when we go into these offices. So, and you can deliver that story either directly to your member of Congress, or you can deliver it to the media or via social media. And just encourage you all to keep lifting up your own stories and stories of your communities. So I will stop there. That was a lot. And now we're at 8:30 already, and we promised all this time for questions. And
We're only at 7:30.
oh yes, I'm so sorry. Yes, I forgot about time differences.
That was both of you. Thank you so much. I don't know about everyone else on here, but I had heard of almost everything that you said, Ross, but I've never heard anyone just summarize it like that. It has come over the last couple months, right? And hearing it summarized within, a 45-minute period is really scary. It's really scary. So I hope folks heed Sam's words of action and know that people in DC are telling us that it's working a little bit. They're feeling it. So, Eth, I think you're in the question curation business.
Yeah, it's not too difficult. People did an excellent job of putting just comments in the chat and putting questions in the Q&A mostly. Also, don't forget to scroll through the chat and look for any of those links in there. So a couple good resources and links you may be interested in. Meanwhile, we just have a few questions and or comments in the Q&A. So I don't know if you want to access those. They're not too difficult to aggregate.
Yeah. Do you want me to just run through them?
That'd be great.
Sure. Shannon asked about in answer to the worry for staffing, safety, and stewardship in national parks, do you feel the land back movement has promise in the face of long-term solutions? Um, you know, I don't know enough to say, yes or no about the land back movement. I know a bit about it. I'll say one thing we've worked on a lot at the National Wildlife Federation is co-management of public lands with the agencies that have been set up and funded to manage those lands and the tribes who have an ancestral claim to those lands. I think that co-management and land back obviously are different. So I would say though, like the lack of funding and staffing means that steps like co-management are going to be more difficult to administer. The staff who build the relationships with tribes to manage wildlife together, their jobs have probably in some cases been lost. I don't know. It's certainly under threat, and then the resources to administer those programs are under threat. So that's not a neat answer to your question, but maybe touches on your concern, your line of thought there. Um, Mary asked if National Wildlife Refuge degradation of funding and staffing, is that a setup for the sale of public lands? I, you know, I guess maybe. I don't know the intent here. Uh, it certainly wouldn't be the first time that uh, a federal resources was underfunded and then criticized for being ineffective. That's kind of a tried and true strategy. Honestly, I think that strategy is probably more likely in the case of some of our agencies where, if all the staff has been gutted from an agency and all the resources for it to do its work are no longer in place, and then it's doing a bad job, then critics will start to point to how, should we really have that agency in the first place? But yeah, it's possible. It's just hard to know for certain. I can read out the comment here from an anonymous attendee. Indirect impacts of the administration's actions are powerful. The Missouri Department of Conservation is funded through a dedicated eighth of a cent sales tax. With consumer confidence down, people aren't buying goods as they would normally, which means MDC is expecting a shortfall, leading to significant budget cuts for the next fiscal year. Yeah, like you said, impacts are multi-layered. Honestly, the federal government and grants support state agencies too. There are block grants to states that support a lot of the programs that your state agencies implement. So, yes, these impacts are going to show up all over the place in different parts of the economy and in local governments and state governments and across the country. So, thank you for that comment.
Very good. That pretty much sums up the Q&As we've gotten so far. Dana, do you have any burning questions? It looks like you have something you want to say.
I have a bunch of questions, but I will wait my questions. We might see some of these folks actually in Washington, and then I can pepper them with questions myself. But we do have one in the chat, and Shauna is in very big trouble for putting it in the chat instead of the Q&A. But where can we get more information on NEPA rollbacks? Do you guys have a handy reference?
Should have a handy reference, and I'm embarrassed to say that I don't. I have to dig it up, but I can share with you all, and hopefully you can get it out to folks, because it's, yes, we definitely have that, and we just closed a comment period on NEPA, so that's part of why I think some of our actions and things are no longer live, but that I was looking for, but yes, I can dig up some of what just happened and what's coming.
Thank you. Some of this information is really difficult because everything's happened so fast. I mean, I'm a GIS expert, and I've been trying to find as much data as I can on public lands impacts, on uh, lease terminations. The last I knew, there was over 180 lease terminations affecting everything from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to USGS offices across the state and across the country, across the world. And looking at impacts on specific programs, it's just the impacts are so vast, and you can almost get lost in trying to find all that information. Yet some of it's really difficult to get a hold of, like the amount of firings and things like that have been really challenging to get a hold of, to come with concrete facts. It's tough.
Well, we are left with some nice comments in the chat in the Q&A for you both that are certainly totally well deserved. All right, if
Well,
there's no more questions.
the National Wildlife Federation is awesome. People there are awesome. National Wildlife Action Fund is pretty awesome too. I think that you do a lot of good things. So we really appreciate all you do.
Thanks for having us on, guys. And go Cardinals.
We're gonna get you back here.
Thank
All
you so
right.
much.
Good
It's so
night,
good to meet you.
everybody. Thanks for putting this together, Sam and Ross.